XCOM UFO Defense was a great game. It's got a brutal atmosphere and an impressive amount of freedom of choice. It was also a hugely immersive game that got you to believe you were fighting off a real alien invasion, instead of just tackling one scenario after another. It's a shame that no one ever tried transferring the same mechanics from XCOM to a fantasy medieval setting. A real shame. Well, some German gamers also thought it was a shame, and decided to make a game like that themselves. Battle Brothers is a turn-based strategy RPG mix for PC, and it was developed by Overhype Studios, a small independent team from Germany. The game is about leading a mercenary company in a gritty, low-fantasy world, and doing your best to survive and thrive. When you boot up a new campaign in Battle Brothers, you have several options that allow you to tailor the game to your playstyle. You can select the difficulty level, which will determine how much equipment costs at shops, how much contracts pay, and the level of enemy presence on your overworld map. You can also select whether or not you want to be a save-scumming peasant or try Iron Man mode, which doesn't allow manual saving and restricts you to a single autosave file that will delete if your company dies. You also have the opportunity to choose your first late game crisis. A late game crisis occurs about 80 days into the game and affects the entire overworld. It could be a war between NobleHouses where you can choose to take a side or stay on the sidelines, or it could be an undead scourge that threatens the world. You can also just select random and let the game choose a late game crisis for you. You also get to choose whether or not you want to allow for permanent destruction, which would allow towns and cities to be permanently destroyed, and if you let the world go down in flames, it's game over. You also get the opportunity to choose your mercenary company's name and what banner they fight under. Once you've gone through all that, the game starts and you're greeted to a little story exists for the game. The leader of your mercenary company has been slain along with most of your comrades, and now you're in charge. It's up to you to rebuild your company and get revenge against the evil bandit leader who slaughtered your company. Or not. You could ignore the bandits who slaughtered you altogether. The choice is yours. From that point, the game opens up and you're free to adventure how you please. Battle Brothers has two different layers to its gameplay, a strategic layer and a tactical combat layer. The strategic layer involves the world map. The world map is randomly generated at the beginning of each game, as it looks similar to the world map in Mount and Blade games. You can see towns, roads, and terrain, and you can see any group of people moving on the map as long as they're within your line of sight. Traveling on roads is quicker, but traveling off-road can reveal hidden sites to explore that might have unique equipment for you to loot. Settlements in the game are designed so that players can see at a glance what they can expect to find there. Outside of each settlement are different structures that represent economic, industrial, and military buildings, which will tell you what kind of shops and goods you'll come across. Once you visit a settlement once, you can just hover your mouse over it, which will give you a list of different shops that it has so you don't have to visit it. Once inside a settlement, you can visit the market to get basic equipment like food or tools, along with low-level weapons and armor, or you could go to a more specialized shop that will have much higher level equipment. You could also visit a tavern to get rumors about the world, such as the location of some ancient ruins, or you could just buy a round of drinks for your company, which will increase their spirits, but you gotta be careful, because if you have them drink too much, they'll get drunk, which will affect their performance in combat. If you have any wounded mercenaries, you can visit a temple, and for a certain amount of gold, you can have them fix their injuries. Or if you need someone leveled up, you can visit training grounds, which will allow you to pay some gold to increase the XP they gain from combat. And that's pretty useful later on in the game when you're buying new recruits, and you need to level them up fast. There's always the barber you can visit if you want to customize the hair, face, or facial hair of your mercenaries, and you can do it for free. Settlements are also where you're going to pick up your new recruits for your mercenary company, and each of them comes with their own background, which will affect their stats, along with up to 2 randomly selected traits, or no traits at all. You could end up with a good trait like Iron Jaw, which will give them a higher threshold before they sustain an injury, or you could get a bad trait like Greedy, which will cause them to ask for a higher salary and makes them a lot quicker to leave if you run out of crowns. And you won't find out if they're good or bad until you've already recruited them. Plus, certain backgrounds and traits can result on events that occur later in the game. Like say you recruit a rat catcher, you could end up with an event where one of the rats that they catch gets loose and causes some of your company to get sick. Settlements are also where you'll pick up contracts in the game. Contracts essentially act as missions, and you can choose to turn down or accept a contract, and you're limited to only taking on one contract at a time. Contracts come with different difficulties, which are shown by the number of skulls, and you can haggle for a better price on the contract, but don't push too hard or you'll lose the contract entirely. Contracts are made up of a variety of different tasks, like you could be asked to be a caravan guard, you could be asked to track down thieves who stole precious objects from a settlement, or you could be asked to find out what mysterious creature is killing villagers in creepy ways. Contracts aren't the only mission that you can get in the game, you can also work towards completing what's known as an ambition. At random points in the game, your company will have you select from a list of goals to work toward, like saving up gold for a banner, or defeating an enemy group of a certain size. Completing an ambition will give your company 100 renown, and can occasionally offer other rewards, like increasing your total inventory space. Failure to complete an ambition will negatively impact your entire party's morale. When you complete contracts and ambitions, you'll slowly increase your reputation and renown. Renown is how reliable and competent people of the world judge a mercenary company to be, and a higher renown gives you higher paying and more difficult contracts to complete. Your reputation reflects how people judge your company's conduct. Do they see you as bloodthirsty animals or merciful saviors? You will receive different types of contracts and treatment based on your reputation. The meat of the gameplay in Battle Brothers, though, doesn't come from its strategic layer, it comes from its combat layer. Battle Brothers is a turn-based tactical combat game. Its map uses a hex grid. You're limited to having a roster of up to only 12 mercenaries on the battlefield at a time, but your enemy, on the other hand, doesn't have that limit at all. There are no individual turns for the player or the AI to move all their characters at once. Instead, it uses what's known as an initiative system. Initiative in the game is calculated based on a character's action points, their accumulated fatigue, and the armor they're wearing. So it can be smart to equip light armor on certain characters just to improve their standing in the initiative order. One factor to worry about in the game is terrain, which will come into play and can offer different bonuses or penalties. Like, say your company's in a swamp, it'll cause them to move slower and suffer a penalty to their melee defense. So you'll encourage to hightail them out of the swamp as soon as possible and on the dry land. You also need to consider elevation, which can influence how far a character can see and give additional range to ranged weapons that are shooting downhill. Melee fighters also get an attack bonus for having the higher ground, so to be sure to make use of the Obi-Wan strategy. The game also has what's known as the Zone of Control, and the Zone of Control is an area 1 hex around the character who is equipped with a melee weapon. If you try and leave the Zone of Control, you suffer an attack of opportunity from the opponent whose Zone of Control you're in. If the attack lands, not only will it hurt your character, it'll prevent you from moving. It will also steal all the action points you spent trying to move. Morale also plays a large role in combat as well, and can turn the tide of a match quickly. When a character's morale falls below their base morale, they need to perform what's known as a morale check, and if they pass that morale check twice in a row, they panic and flee. The game also introduces a mechanic called Overwhelming, where your squad can be granted a to-hit bonus for each character who's attacking a defending character in close combat during a single round. It's a great mechanic for dealing with tougher enemies, or getting rid of weaker enemies more quickly. Different weapon types in the game also have different effectiveness in combat. For instance, a sword is great at giving out consistent damage and has a low fatigue penalty, but it isn't that effective against armor. Maces, on the other hand, have a higher fatigue cost and do less damage overall, but they're great at breaking down armored enemies. Each weapon type also has its own special skills that you can use. For instance, axes can specifically target shields and destroy them, whereas spears have the ability known as Spear Wall. The Spear Wall is a skill you can only activate when no one is in your zone of control, and it'll give you an attack of opportunity against anybody who tries to move into your zone. As combat starts to wind down, enemies may choose to flee, and you can choose to let them go, or you can run them down. During combat, it's possible to suffer an injury if an attack deals at least 10 points of damage to your hit points. Injuries impose certain penalties on a character and negatively impact their overall combat effectiveness. There's also different types of injuries in the game: permanent and temporary. A temporary injury is something that can be healed at a temple, or after a certain amount of time, heal on its own. Permanent injuries are received when a member of your company has their hit points knocked down to 0, but they don't die. Instead of dying, they just suffer an injury that never goes away and imposes a permanent stat penalty. You can also see permanent injuries represented on a character's portrait, like an eye patch on a character who's lost their eye. After a battle, you get to see how your mercenaries performed and pick out what loot you want to take. If you're a pack rat like me, that'll pose problems. You also get to find out whether a character earned enough experience to level up. Every time you level up, you can select from 3 different stats that you want to increase, and do so based on how good the rolls are, or what stats you want to increase for that particular character. Each level up also comes through your choice of a perk, and there are multiple perk tiers. You could choose the rotation perk, which will allow you to switch the places of 2 characters and completely ignore zone of control. This is really helpful if you have a character who you need to get out of combat who's fatigued or wounded, and you don't want them to die. Before every combat encounter, you can also change the formation of your troops from your inventory screen. Select whether you want more ranged fighters in the back, or characters with polearms that can reach and attack from 2 tiles away. You can also sideline wounded characters and let them heal instead of putting them at risk in combat. The game gives you a nice little obituary page for your fallen troops. It'll show you their name, how long they were with your company, the number of battles they were in, and how many kills they got. It also gives you a detailed description of how they died, like Baldemar the Sacrifice here, who was hammered to death by a brigand raider. It's also important to make sure that your company has adequate resources, like having enough gold to pay for supplies and the salaries of your mercenaries, or ammunition for your ranged weapons, or tools and medicine to repair your equipment and heal your mercenaries. Food's also important, and you should make sure to stock up before venturing too far away from towns. The music for the game was composed by the duo known as Breakdown Epiphanies. The themes they composed for the game draw from different inspirations, and work to create different sounds for each of the factions and encounters. For example, the Orc themes are inspired by Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings score, and are heavy on brass and drums. whereas the bandit themes are carried by smaller percussion ensembles and lots of steel string guitar to go for a sort of folk and orchestral music mix. There's also one of my favorite tracks in the game, which is used for battles involving noble house armies, and it's reminiscent of Ramin Djawadi's theme for Game of Thrones. It's got strings, brass, choir, and it's apparently a contender for the most notes played per minute in the soundtrack. The whole score is a real treat for your ears, and it'll provide a suitable playlist for bashing in heads and making gold. There's an interesting story behind the visuals in the game. You see, Overhype Studios began development with full-body pictures that were animated in Flash, which you can see here in an early screenshot. It also allows you to see that the game used to use squares instead of hexes. The team immediately realized how much work would be involved to accomplish the look, and decided that their small team simply couldn't do it, especially considering they only have one programmer and one artist. So, they worked on cutting down animations and making them simpler. The next step though was eliminating full body representations, which were time consuming to create, but they still wanted to maintain the ability of the player to see what a character was wearing and wielding at a glance, which would be a little more difficult without a full body representation. Taking a page from the game Unity of Command, the team decided to experiment with a similar look using busts placed on sockets, which kind of gave the characters a sort of, figurine look. This allowed equipment like armor and weapons to be easily recognizable to the player, and it also saved the dev team work of designing different poses and hand positions for each weapon type. Simplifying the characters in this way also allowed for the customization that they wanted without too much work. All they needed to do was layer everything. Characters have individual heads, they can have visible injuries, and each piece of armor has its own damage variance. This picture here shows how each character for the game is composed. The game's visual style uses a painted and detailed look. The characters are almost character-like, featuring large heads and prominent facial features. The developers intentionally made their characters look kinda cute to provide an interesting contrast to the dark setting and violent battles. They wanted the players to sympathize with their characters, feeling the impact of their loss beyond the mere loss to combat effectiveness. There's also something more comical to seeing a somewhat cute character-like character dying. The somewhat exaggerated look also makes the characters more iconic and readable, no matter how zoomed out you are. In the end, the developers took into consideration both aesthetics and functionality when it came to designing the look of their game. Personally, I love the end product. As much as I enjoy the game, it isn't without its drawbacks, such as the fact that the game is very much based on RNG, or the random number generator, all the way from its world generation to its combat rolls. If you're used to playing games like XCOM and seeing a soldier miss a shot with a 90% chance to hit, it shouldn't be too bothersome, but if you're not used to playing games that are heavy on RNG, it can be frustrating. A bad roll can put your team in a worse position on the combat map, forcing your characters to battle against an enemy set up on a hill. It could also mean a slew of recruits for your company who have awful stats. I personally love the random nature and the chaos it produces, but not everyone will see it like I do. The game also doesn't technically have an ending, which might be fine for a person like me who will enjoy the journey more than the destination, but if you're looking for a goal to work towards or some kind of closure with the game, you're not going to really find it. Like, the game doesn't end once you complete a late game crisis, it just continues on, allowing you to get contracts until another crisis pops up. Though if there is an end goal you kind of want to work towards or you want an ending, there is technically retirement. You can select to retire at any point in the game that you choose, so once you've done everything with your mercenary company you plan to do, you can select to retire and then see how the company fared in the absence of your leadership. This could mean they prospered, suffered, or something in between. No matter what the outcome, retiring will greet you with an end screen, with text detailing both the exploits of your company and what happened to them. Easily the game's biggest problem for me is probably its very clunky inventory management. You see, you have to click through multiple submenus just to compare items in your inventory, and then click through each individual soldier and their equipment. With up to 20 soldiers to equip, it can be a lot of tedium just to do this, especially if you want to compare an item you find in a shop to an item you're wearing. It doesn't really ruin the experience, but it is irritating. Some people interested in playing Battle Brothers might wonder if the game has Battle Sisters. The answer is no. Because of the size of their team, they had to focus on certain things that they wanted to be able to ship the game on time. Making Battle Sisters would have added to the workload because they would need to create their own portraits and give them their own unique backgrounds that would account for how a quasi-medieval world treats them, because they didn't want them to just be male characters with different heads. In fact, here's an example of what a Battle Sister would look like. They were also limited to making one ethnicity and culture, mainly the Germanic people. They wanted to add more cultures, but again, their small team limited what they could do. Adding another culture would have really added to the workload. Like, they wanted to say make an Oriental-based culture, they would have to come up with their own unique looks, names, character backgrounds, architecture, lore, events, and even beasts based on Oriental folklore. It would have been a lot of work, especially when you only have one artist and programmer to work on it. Another limitation of their small team is the fact that the game is currently limited to being in English only. The developer would like to expand on all of these in future updates, or perhaps even an expansion pack, but for the main game they wanted to focus on polish and just making sure the core gameplay was great. The game is well made and contains plenty of replay value with its procedurally generated and dynamic worlds. I followed the game back when it was in early access all the way up until its release on Steam March 28th of this year. If you like tactical combat games like Jagged Alliance or XCOM, or you love the thrill of leading your own band of vagabonds like in Mount & Blade or Sid Meier's Pirates, I highly recommend picking up this game. It was one of my most highly anticipated games of 2017, and it didn't disappoint at all. It's currently on Steam for $30. Well, that's the end of my review. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, hit that like button. If you want to see more, subscribe and check out other videos on my channel, like this one. Anyways, thanks for watching, and have a great day.
You can't touch this. You can't touch this. You can't touch this. You can't touch this.